Hi, everyone. I'm Bill Squadron, President of Our Energy Policy, and welcome to today's webinar in OEP's Energy Leaders webinar series on the future of nuclear. This is going to be a robust discussion among a terrific panel on a topic that's of enormous significance in the energy sector. And we're going to have, in a few minutes, a terrific conversation about the issues associated with nuclear's role in a clean energy future. I also want to point out to everyone online that we will, about 40 minutes into the hour, open it up to audience questions. On your dashboard, there's a tab for questions. Just type them in and we'll get to them. We'll get to as many as we can that you put in. And we also will have at OEP's website an online discussion following this over the next week. So if for some reason your comments or questions cannot be reached today during the conversation, there'll be plenty of opportunity to weigh in with your thoughts and questions in that online discussion. I also want to thank our partners and supporters for their ongoing generosity and support in contributing to this webinar series. Our underwriter BP, our partners API, EPSA, the National Grid, Bracewell, Schiff Hardin, the J.M. Kaplan Fund, Clean Fight New York, Con Edison, Grace Richardson Fund, Shepherd Mullen, Eastern Generation, and US Grid. Thank you for all your support. And I also, of course, want to thank my co-host today, Michael Shatskin. I'm going to turn things over to him in just a second. Mike has a long and distinguished history in the book publishing industry, and most recently is the co-founder of ClimateChangeResource.org, which I'd encourage all of you to use as frequently as you can. So I'm now going to turn it over to Mike, who will open up the session today, and he'll then, of course, introduce our panel. Mike?
Thanks very much, Bill. I'm delighted to be given the opportunity to sponsor this Our Energy Policy session on nuclear power, and I want to tell you why. In 2016, I decided to devote most of my time to climate change. I'd come to the conclusion that greenhouse gases, if unchecked, would be an existential threat to human civilization just beyond my lifetime, and I thought I should carve out time for the rest of my active life to try to address it. The most tangible evidence of this career change is a website that Bill referred to that I've co-financed and co-developed. It's ClimateChangeResources.org. So I started to learn. My intense interest in what this session will cover was sparked by what I learned about nuclear power, proceeding from the reasonably conventional position of many environmentalist activist liberal Democrats that it was somehow associated with nuclear weapons and was dangerous and should be dismissed. I concluded that objections from my tribe, many of whom understand and fear the effects of CO2, were fueled by two big misunderstandings. One is that the three great events of nuclear power history, and we know them all, 3 Mile Island, Chernobyl, and Fukushima, are so often reflexively cited as justifications to oppose nuclear power, but they actually prove that it is safe, not that it is dangerous. And the fact that there are only those three events to cite is in itself stark evidence of nuclear safety. The other is the common citing of the waste, but we don't know what to do with the waste, as a reason to oppose nuclear plants. While I have no objections to thinking the question through further, and we probably should have some better long-term plan, the fact is the waste from nuclear power in the US has never harmed anybody. Our methods of storage have been more than adequate for half a century. It is not a reason to oppose the only large-scale, no CO2 power we've got. The other thing I'd like to add to set the stage is a bit of context. The no carbon future we all need is seen as powered by renewables. Wind and solar are intermittent. For them to really take over energy generation, one or more of 3 other technologies, nuclear, carbon capture, or batteries, must have massive breakthroughs. Frankly, only nuclear among those 3 can certainly provide the energy needed to sufficiently complement renewables at our present level of technological development. Battery storage today is measured in hours when we need it to work for months. And carbon capture with sequestration is quite sensible, but nowhere near large-scale implementation. I am a confirmed all of the above man. We need to be working on all 3 and take our breakthroughs where we can get them. Time is too tight and the consequences are too dire for us to be cavalier about whether it is nuclear, carbon capture, or batteries that save us. Nuclear is essential. We need to develop new nukes, molten salt and small modular and fusion. And we have to conquer the largely irrational fear of the nuclear power plants we already have. I look forward to the discussion among this very knowledgeable group here today. I now want to introduce Jessica Lovering, who will lead that conversation. Jessica is the co-founder and co-executive director of the Good Energy Collective, a policy research organization with the mission to build a progressive case for nuclear energy as an essential part of the broader climate change agenda. She was also formerly the director of the energy program at the Breakthrough Institute, a pioneering research institute changing how people think about energy and the environment. Her work at Breakthrough sought policies to spur innovation in nuclear power technologies to drive down costs and accelerate deployment as part of a solution to climate change and economic development. So I'm happy to turn it over to Jessica, who will take over with her panel. Thanks very much.
All right, thanks for the introduction, Mike. Those were great remarks. And I'm going to introduce our panel today. So when you can all turn on your webcams now or when I call your name, but we have a great collection of folks to talk with us today. I'm really excited. So first we have Chris Colbert. He's the Chief Financial Officer and the Chief Strategy Officer at NuScale Power. We have Allison McFarland, who is the director of the UBC School of Public Policy and Global Affairs and formerly the chairman of the U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission. And last but not least, we have John Kotek, who's the senior vice president of policy development and public affairs at the Nuclear Energy Institute. So welcome, everybody. So I'm going to kick off a question that's for everyone and just set the stage for kind of the current state of affairs with nuclear energy today. So in this year, 2021, we're expected to have 5 nuclear reactors close. And this would be a record for the most nuclear capacity retirements in 1 year in the US. And, you know, the consensus around this, according to Department of Energy, is that it's largely due to competition from very cheap natural gas and also lower costs of renewables and surplus renewable generation at certain times of day or certain seasons. So what do each of you see as the main challenges for the existing fleet of nuclear? And can anything be done, should anything be done to keep them operating longer?
Okay. You want me to jump in?
Sure.
Oh, go ahead, Al.
You go ahead, John, and then I'll jump in.
Okay. So in terms of can something be done? Yes. Should something be done? Yes. Just for context, for those of us who care about carbon and climate, for perspective, you know, just pick 2 of the reactors in Illinois, for example. You know, 2 of the Illinois reactors will produce more carbon-free generation in a year than all 7,200 wind turbines in the state of California. It's an enormous amount of clean energy that's at risk if these plants shut down. We have seen states take action. Illinois, New Jersey, New York, Connecticut have all taken either legislative or other action to preserve nuclear generation. And we've seen 15 plants that otherwise might have closed still in operation as a result of state policies. Given that climate, is a national and global issue, this really is a challenge that Congress ultimately needs to take on. And so I think ultimately we need to get to a policy that provides support for existing clean generation provided by nuclear power to ensure that we don't take a big step back in the climate space. Fortunately, we are seeing things like clean energy standards that are technology neutral that would embrace the role that nuclear energy plays. We've seen just last week with the Biden administration with their American Jobs Act proposal, recognizing the important role of the existing fleet. So I think the conversation has started to move to Washington, D.C. In the short term, we need to make sure some action is taken either state level or federal level to keep those plants from closing and losing more well-run nuclear plants. Thanks.
Okay, Alison.
So I think that, yes, clearly there's competition from cheap natural gas and renewables at times. That's correct, but that's only part of the story. The other two parts that I think are essential to understand to solve the problem, if that's what you want to do, is to understand that demand is an issue. And in some parts of the country where there's a lot of nuclear, demand has been decreasing because in part population has been decreasing. People have been moving away from the north and the Midwest, northern Midwest, and they've been moving to the west and the south. Okay, so there is a demand issue, and a demand issue that certainly appeared after the 2008 recession when demand decreased across the board. So there's that issue. But then the other issue, which I think is more important, more significant, and more difficult to solve, are the electricity markets. Most of the electricity markets in the US make it really hard for nuclear to compete. They value, and this is an arbitrary value setting, it doesn't have to be this way, but they value plants that can come online quickly and move quickly instead of the steady baseload power that nuclear provides and has to by design. So that has to change to address some of these issues, I think.
Okay, sorry, it always takes me a while to figure out which platform I'm on. So thanks for having me here today and being part of this event. Just quickly, NuScale Power. We're not an owner of existing existing plants that are shutting down. We're looking to build new ones to replace and provide energy in the future with our advanced small modular reactor. And I think that both John and Allison kind of hit the points and framed it. The question is, what do you do? People have been talking about trying to correct the markets and fix it for years. I've been listening to it happen for years. But I think there is really a movement afoot where you could see the fact isn't the cheap renewables and natural gas, it's that you don't properly value the nuclear being 7x24 carbon-free contributor to the overall clean energy system. And some companies are starting to look at that. Google, for example, has a mandate to go 7x24 clean, not just on a net basis, but instantaneously round the clock. That if you had that same policy being adopted by the US government or other agencies that included nuclear as part of that and said, not by 2030, not by 2040, but by 2023, you could have 7x24 clean energy if you had a portfolio that included nuclear in it. You could drive that process to see that demand signal go in to take up and support those plans. So I think there's a real opportunity for both the government and a lot of the leading edge consumer-facing companies that have made commitments to accelerate it and include nuclear, which would benefit the existing fleet, because then their contribution to clean energy would be valued, would be acknowledged. Right now, it just isn't. And I think we've been tilting at the windmill of expecting markets to fix the problem for us for long enough that we need to think about something different.
Okay. Great. That's good framing for the rest of our conversation. It's quite a challenge right now with what to do about the existing fleet. So moving on to another concern that people have, Mike mentioned the 3 big accidents, nuclear accidents that we've experienced. So Safety is an often cited concern when people talk about nuclear. And the question I wanted to ask is, do you think there's an inherent trade-off between safety and cost for nuclear? And maybe it's different for the existing fleet and for new nuclear or advanced reactor concepts that are going through licensing now. So I'm going to kick this to Chris first, and I'm sure Allison has some thoughts on this as well.
So, absolutely, there's a trade-off. The way that NuScale's approached it, and you're right, there's a difference between traditionally what's been done and what we're doing. But we've looked to make our design simpler so that it eliminates the need for a lot of the safety systems and components that you have in a large typical plant. And when you have less stuff for safety, that means you have less stuff to buy and install, operate, maintain, fix when it breaks, or be worried about in terms of a situation where it breaks and causes an accident. Well, all those things really lead to improved safety, where we have orders of magnitude, lower CDF, core damage frequencies than the existing fleet, while reducing the cost because we don't have all that extra stuff that goes along with it. But there is a trade-off, and the trade-off is efficiency, right? So we have a natural circulation system. We don't have pumps to move the primary coolant, so we have a little bit slightly lower efficiency. Right now, nuclear fuel is not the largest contributor to the cost of delivering a megawatt from a nuclear plant. So that trade-off in terms of efficiency versus what you get in reliability, overall cost and safety is one that we see is worth it, and our customers are as well. So they are related, but not in the way that people typically think about it, where it's really a zero-sum game. I think there's a game there, actually.
Yeah, I would say that safety is not an either or. It's not an option to pick cheaper cost over safety. And there's one reason for that. When there's an accident, nuclear accident anywhere in the world, it affects, that the old adage, an accident anywhere is an accident everywhere, right? But it's true, okay? That's what we saw from the Fukushima accident. It happened in Japan. We can debate the reasons why it happened, but it certainly impacted the nuclear industry in the US and in France and in Sweden and in Spain and in China as well. All these countries spent billions of dollars upgrading their system because of the operational experience that was gained from the accident at Fukushima. So safety's a really important issue, and so it's not something that can be discounted.
Yep. And the only thing I'll add to that, Jessica, is Chris's company is one of dozens of companies that is seeking to innovate and bring next generation nuclear energy systems to market. Having been in this business for more than 30 years now, I got my start in DOE back in the 80s and 90s when the focus of the R&D programs, it was safety, and cost wasn't that much of a consideration. These days, safety and cost are integrated considerations. Chris's company, their design, I think, can effectively address both. A lot of these other innovators are trying to do the same thing, address cost and safety through simplicity. And so I think we've got an opportunity to see a next generation of nuclear energy systems come to market that offers an even better and more compelling value proposition in both of those areas going forward.
Okay, great. So moving on to kind of the last big challenge for nuclear energy, I want to make sure we get all the big concerns. So the Biden campaign and some of their energy platform, they called specifically for investing in advanced nuclear, which was really cool to see, but it came with the caveat that it needed to eliminate the risks associated with conventional nuclear. So one of those risks that's a big obstacle, particularly for public perception around new nuclear, is the waste. And we currently have it sitting at, I don't know, close to 70 sites around the country. So I want to start with Allison. Do you have any ideas for how to break the political gridlock on nuclear waste and kind of make progress?
Well, you could equally throw this over to John. I think we did a really good job on the Blue Ribbon Commission, right, John? I mean, I think our recommendations were excellent. They still stand, and the country should follow them. But, you know, the problem right now is that almost nobody has a strong incentive to make progress. And really, progress has to be made by Congress. Congress has to act because the current system is broken. There's no there's no implementer available right now. The funding for this, for dealing with nuclear waste in the country, is terribly, terribly broken. And that must be fixed. It must be addressed. And the only one who can address it is Congress. Unfortunately, for most congressmen and senators, their time horizons are 2 or 6 years. They're not the time horizon of nuclear waste, and it doesn't really impact what they do. But as we see more and more nuclear plants shut down in the US, we're having more and more communities that don't want to be the permanent repositories for this material. And so those communities themselves have a lot of incentive to act and put pressure on their political representatives. And so that's, I think, where we're going to have to work on this. You know, I hope the Biden administration takes this issue seriously and feels the responsibility to deal with it, because it's on us to manage this safely. I think the last 4 years showed us that we can't have faith that our institutions will last a long time and serve us well.
Just to build on that, what I've seen out of the new administration, I think, is an indication that they intend to take this issue seriously. There's a recognition that for nuclear energy to achieve its full potential as a tool in a decarbonized energy system, we're going to have to demonstrate progress on the waste issue. We've seen Secretary Granholm in her confirmation hearing and in statements since then indicate a willingness to work on this issue. Of course, the industry is eager to work with the administration and Congress to achieve some progress in this area. So I do think we're going to see some meaningful steps forward here, particularly as the new administration gets their full team in place. It's still a work in progress, but as they get that team up and running, I think we'll see more in this area.
Okay, great.
Yeah, and so I just note that those 70 sites, I mean, they've been safely doing it for, years, some cases decades, and no leaks, no thefts, plenty of funding to do both. But it would be more effective to have centralized repositories, centralized interim storage facilities, all at recommendations that came out of the Blue Ribbon Commission. And what I see it coming down to is really the point that Allison made, is that it comes down to is money. Not that there isn't money, there is money, but getting access to it and using it has really been the real challenge for folks. Because frankly, communities accept all manner of undesirable yet necessary infrastructure, dumps, prisons, you name it, they accept it. Many of which are far more impactful, far less regulated, and poorly capitalized. I mean, how many times do you see a junkyard that is just left there, or a pile of tires someplace in the middle? It's just not regulated, funded the way it would be. But unfortunately, the approach in many instances in these decisions is to ignore those impacts and really force that undesirable infrastructure without any consideration of mitigation for politically disadvantaged communities, whether here or in the United States. But to put maybe just a little bit twist on it about the undesirability, it is interesting to note that in Finland, they've done a community-based or consent-based process, and they're building a repository. And you have the communities around Indian Point now saying that spent fuel is actually an asset that should be assessed and taxed. So I think there is an element there that the community can assess and manage the risk if properly compensated for it and to provide for it. And just the last thing I'll note is that this question came up, and I've been, as part of my job, working with UAMPS and their first project. They had over 150 community meetings. This question always comes up. And I'll tell you, while we're all afraid of it in this panel, the way we always phrase it, like it is the big issue, once you talk to people about it, it is not the big issue we think it is, but we do need to find a solution because they don't understand why we haven't solved it when you tell them what's going on.
Okay, great, thanks. So shifting gears a little bit to talk about kind of the future of nuclear in the U.S. I'm going to direct this question first to Chris, but anyone can answer. Do you think there is a future for large conventional nuclear plants in the U.S., or will any sort of new plants in the U.S. be smaller and modular? You can also answer outside the U.S., but let's start with the U.S.
Yeah, I'll start the U.S. So, I think siting a large conventional nuclear plants in the United States, those opportunities are limited because, generally speaking, you need to have redundant transmission interconnections for their safety, or you need to have a 10-mile emergency planning zone around it, sufficient water supply for its long-term cooling. So, a lot of those opportunities already have existing nuclear plants at them. So to find that set of places, it really kind of next down. Now, there are some large coal plant sites where maybe they have all those attributes where you can do it. But again, a lot of the plants in the United States are in that kind of 600 megawatt range-ish kind of thing for coal plants. That makes it a little bit more challenging to site. So when you look at small modular reactors like NuScale's, the things you have is that just the scale of it, it fits more easily. If it's a 600 megawatt plant, you can replace it with a 600 megawatt plant. You can scale them. The second aspect is with the newer designs, particularly NuScale's, you don't need to be in the middle of 5 transmission lines because we don't require power for our safety case. So you can be, at the end of a line. Our emergency planning zone can actually be at the site boundary. So that really reduces the impact of the surrounding community and infrastructure. Then finally, we can dry cool the plant. So you can reduce the water usage by about 95%. And just have the water you need inside, in our case, the reactor building for safety. And that's all you need. So all those reasons kind of opens up the aperture for smaller plants, especially if you look at the opportunity of replacing existing coal plants in the United States, or even overseas where they have smaller grids, where it's even more challenging to find a site that has all those attributes you need for a large plant.
And Jessica, I think you're right to expand the question to include the global marketplace, because in fact that's what we're seeing built globally is still the large plants. And so I think there's room for a wide range of product offerings. Certainly to Allison's earlier point, there are places in the US you just don't have the demand growth. But as you look at other parts of the world where electricity demand growth is significantly higher than it is here, I think you'll see an opportunity in those markets for some of the large plants. And and I think it behooves us as a nation to have a wide range of technology offerings, because it's really helpful if the U.S. is competing and winning in the civil nuclear energy marketplace because of what it delivers for us in terms of the ability to help really set the standard in terms of global safety, non-proliferation norms, and just the long-term relationships you build when you supply a nuclear power system in another country.
So let me jump in here and bring a little bit of debate. I don't know that it's possible in terms of economies of scale for truly small modular reactors to actually survive and compete. I mean, if we look at NuScale, you're looking at building the 12 packs. You're not really looking at one-off, and it's not clear to me that a one-off can survive. And so that's, that seems to be where things are going right now. I don't know, I don't know, at least that's for the US. There may be some small international markets where, they could manage a very high cost small plant, but those might be few and far between.
Yeah, that's a great point. Just short interjection, economies of scale versus economies of multiples was a big focus of my PhD dissertation, but unfortunately I'm not a panelist, so reach out if you want to learn more.
We get to ask you a question?
Maybe at the end, but so I did want to move on to that supply chain question. we kind of think about this as there's a chicken and an egg problem with advanced nuclear, particularly, you know, these new kind of innovative designs. There's no large scale supply chain without investment, and there's no investment without that large scale supply chain. So I'm going to direct this to John first. Do you have any thoughts on this issue? How can we address it to kind of crack this conundrum?
Yeah, and I appreciate that. And I do think there's a fairly close analog with what we've seen with wind and solar over the last dozen plus years. You know, we invested a lot early on in getting the technology to a stage where it was ready to bring to the marketplace. We then did a really good job at both the state and federal level of creating demand-inducing policies that showed there was going to be a market and gave confidence to the private sector that they could invest in the manufacturing capability and the other things that would be needed to continue working your way down, you know, the learning curve and the cost curve to get to a more competitive product. We're now at the point where I think we are ready for those demand-inducing policies for nuclear in a way that we haven't been before. But I think if we do that smartly, along with, you know, funding the initial public-private partnership demonstration projects that are on the books, I think we can make that happen for nuclear in the same way we've done it for other clean energy technologies.
Can I?
Yeah.
NuScale's perspective. Oh, is it me or is it Allison?
No, go ahead, Chris. You go first.
Okay. So the global supply chain exists for 100% of the NuScale plant today. So there's not any need to invest in large new factories to do it. And that's because we're using light water reactor technology fundamentally, where there's over 400 light water reactors operating globally, being supplied, built up, and redeveloped in place in a lot of instances, or having new steam generators put into them. But that's all there and available. And frankly, about 75% of it can be supplied out of the United States. So the supply chain is there. The next kind of criticism I'll just knock down is that, you know, the need for mass manufacturing, that you need to be, you know, producing thousands of these things to get to the cost that we are talking about. And all the costs that we're looking at, in particular with our first project, is based upon the supply chain as it exists, not the supply chain that's being posited in the future, when I think there will be a large mass manufacturing facilities after there's an order book to justify that investment. But right now, all our economics and those being looked at by our customers are based upon, you know, what's existing in the supply chain today. And like I said, it exists today. The final comment is the flexibility. Former Commissioner Chair is a little bit out of date. UAMPS actually now is looking at a 6 or an 8 module use of the plant, kind of talking to the scalability of the design. And it really does come down to an economic question, right? Is in the US, we're blessed with cheap, abundant energy. I mean, we just have $2 gas, you know, but nobody else in the world has it. So there is some economies of scale for that to work. But that's true not only for nuclear, it's true for solar and wind. You don't build just one windmill, you build 150 of them over 100,000 acres. So there's always that scaling thing that needs to go on for it. But we are finding that in those niches, there's still places where a NuScale plant can scale to what the customer needs to be competitive. And then finally, doing one nuclear plant, you know, you can do it, it comes down to cost. But if you're in a location where your option is to bring in diesel fuel, we can be competitive. The question is, do people want to make that investment and do that way? Do you have the lifetime to make it work? But if you had a mining operation that's remote and someplace else that needs 75 megawatts, it's going to be there for 20 years, I'd be willing to take on those economics.
So let me say that this is the do or die issue, I think now. This is the most significant issue facing nuclear and its future. And the data that we have, the evidence that we have, is not pointing us in an optimistic direction. The experience with the AP1000 should have been a wake-up call to folks to pay attention to the supply chain and construction issues. The plants that made the modules for the AP1000 reactors that are being built in Georgia and the ones that were abandoned in South Carolina could not get it right. They had 3 different owners. They never got the welding right. Nuclear is different. It requires a level of quality assurance and quality control that does not exist in other industries. And it needs people who understand that. It needs skilled workers who can address that, who have the skill set to do that. It needs an integrated project management that does not exist in the United States, and it does not exist in Europe. The same story with the Arribas Orano's EPR. Okay? So unless we can deal with those issues, get that in order, and that is a tall task in a country like ours, where it's all working in the marketplace and go to the lowest bidder kind of thing. If we don't pay attention to this issue, there is no future for nuclear. You will not build anything. It will all be too expensive. It will all take too long. The AP1000 is a good design, but it may be a dead design.
Okay, sobering. So moving to policy, maybe to address some of these issues, just in the last few weeks, we've seen calls from both the White House and Congress for a federal clean electricity standard that would be inclusive of nuclear. So do you think this is the right tactic to integrate nuclear into broader clean energy policies, or does nuclear need its own kind of more targeted policies for deployment?
Let me start off, because you guys probably know a lot more about this than me, but I will just say from my little vantage point that it seems to me that what we really need to do is put a price on carbon, and that will really help nuclear. But we also need to deal with the electricity markets and how they don't fairly value nuclear.
Yeah, certainly a price on carbon, a clean energy standard, even a cap and trade approach, any one of those, if they are technology inclusive or technology neutral and sufficiently ambitious, they can help nuclear, right? They are going to value carbon-free energy in a way that I think is going to both ensure that we keep operating nuclear power plants in operation and are going to create a pathway for a next generation of new build. The other thing that's worth noting is, a lot of the analyses that have been done looking at what it takes to get to 100% clean energy shows there's an important role for firm, clean generation to play. All right, it was a great paper came out just in the last week, for example, looking at the situation in California and the role that firm, clean can play in helping California decarbonize. An analysis done looking at the Pacific Northwest found you can save $8 billion a year if you have both, keep the existing nuclear and you add SMRs versus trying to decarbonize just using wind, solar, hydro, and storage alone. So there's a lot of opportunity within a clean energy policy, regardless of the framework that's used. And I will note that of both the states and the companies that have committed to decarbonize by 2050 or sooner, every one of them that I've seen has looked at their generating mix and has said, we need to keep the nuclear we've got, and we need to create a pathway for something new that's firm and clean, and nuclear is a leading candidate. So everything points in the direction of nuclear having an important role to play.
Okay,
Yeah,
well, I was...
Sorry, I was going to say that the part of having it technology neutral, inclusive, and let them work in their own merits, I think is a good policy to have. I agree with carbon tax would be great because, as I said earlier, the challenge isn't that renewables and natural gas are cheap. The problem is that nuclear isn't valued properly. Carbon tax takes care of that in one way, including it in a clean energy standard does it another way. I frankly am just tired of waiting for somebody to act and do that. I think that companies and consumers have shown that, the one thing about this country is that people vote with their pocketbooks and their wallets. And if people understand that nuclear is part of clean energy and you need to have 24/7 clean energy, not just, hey, I'll run my diesel generator and I'll buy some RECs, renewable energy credits to offset it. it's not getting it to where you need to be. It needs to be instantaneous. That recognition, which could be led by, frankly, the US government and just having their agencies lead that charge, would be a huge signal to be moving that down that path to say, nuclear energy provides something that nobody else can in terms of having reliable baseload 24/7 clean energy. And for 20% of the demand in the United States today, you could achieve that today. Not wait till 2030 or 2035. And once that is sucked up out of the marketplace, then the signal will be there for people like me to come in and do other plants to bring other clean energy. But there's going to be plenty of renewables. There's going to be plenty of everything. I mean, it's just too large a market for it to be any one person. So we tend to get into a fracas amongst ourselves of like, you know, don't take this part away from me. That's mine. You can't have it. The need is just so huge. We can't be having those sort of internecine battles. We need to be focused on how do we get on with starting today to move this forward. Not tomorrow, not the next day, not the day after that, or like, let's hope for 2030 or 2035. We need to start today. And I think people can start today.
Can I add to what Chris said? Because I think he makes a good point there, and I think it should be amplified, is that a country's energy security is well served when it has a diverse supply. And a diverse supply is really important. You saw that with the Fukushima accident, when overnight, almost overnight, a third of their electricity supply was lost because of the nuclear accident. And you don't want to be vulnerable. You don't want to have too much of your electricity supply coming from one particular sector, because if something happens and you lose that, you better have backup.
Thank you very much to our panel. Sorry to jump in there and interrupt Jessica, but we do want to have time for Q&A. We have a lot of questions already lined up. So questions for our panelists, and Jessica, please, of course, as discussion lead moderator, feel free to join in as an expert yourself. First question here for all of you from Yulia Gorgiou. What is the near-term potential to site advanced reactors in place of retiring coal plants? NEI's President Maria Korsnick had a lot of enthusiasm for this.
Yeah, and given that it was my boss that made the comment, maybe I'll jump in. The potential is quite high, and Chris has looked at this quite a bit, I know as well. A lot of the job functions that exist at a nuclear plant have analogs at coal plants. Maria will tell the story of how they used to bring in folks from their fossil fleet to, you know, do certain functions on the nuclear units. Certainly when nuclear first got its start, it was people that had history in fossil coming in to construct and operate the nuclear units. So there's a lot of transferability there. Frankly, there's also the high wages in the nuclear industry, frankly, even higher than you see in the fossil fuel industry that prevail at nuclear plants. If folks haven't seen it, the U.S. Energy Jobs report that came out, USEER report that came out earlier this week, has some great information on wages. Nuclear is far and away the highest average wage in the energy sector. That's the type of thing that a community that currently hosts a coal plant wants to see.
I would say that the potential to site an advanced nuclear, now it depends on what you call advanced. If NuScale is advanced, then maybe it's higher, but some of these other designs, I'd say it's very low in the near future, like 0. Except NuScale.
Well, thank you for that, Allison. I wasn't expecting that, quite honestly. I don't know where to go with that. No, I think there's a huge opportunity for that. I mean, we've been looking at this at NuScale, and just the full disclosure, before I was a nuclear zealot, starting back in 2007, I did 20 years of fossil plant development, coal and natural gas. You know, I've always loved power because I know power makes human life very bearable, livable, and all the things that we expect to have needs electricity, and affordable electricity and reliable electricity. So I come at this just really saying that electricity and energy is a good thing for the human condition. When I look at what happens at a coal plant, you know, the story is the same for these coal plants, that they're typically retiring before the end of their useful life. In many communities, they were a significant contributor to the local economy, the local tax coffers, and the high-paying, you know, even at coal plants, relatively high-paying jobs. And then you go in there and say, you know, hey, the opportunity is for you to work at a wind farm 500 miles away and get paid less, or we're going to bring a high-speed internet connection to your home and you're going to become a Java app developer as your new career. That is not something that's very reassuring to people who've spent 10, 20, 30 years supplying the energy that we all benefited from in the 20th century. A NuScale plant can be put in the same footprint, size-wise, acreage. You can retain and retrain the coal plant workforce. A guy turning a wrench on a pump is doing the same thing at the same pump, probably at a NuScale plant. Not a lot of difference. We're going to get paid slightly more on average, as John mentioned. There's actually slightly more workers at a nuclear plant or at a NuScale plant on a per megawatt basis. And then finally, it's not like it's a bunch of white, people in there in white lab coats with PhDs running it. About 3/4 of the workforce is just high school or associate degree diplomas. So, I mean, good paying jobs meets a lot of needs. People don't need to move. Keep the communities intact. You're not bankrupting those communities, especially rural communities, where the coal plant might be the largest single employer, the largest single contributor to their community. So I think there's a lot of benefit there, not for every site, but there's 145 gigawatts of electric coal plants that are retiring or will be 60 years old by 2040. We don't need to replace all of those for NuScale to be wildly successful. We just need to do maybe 10 gigawatts of that. The rest of it can be solar or whatever. But for the communities that want it, it's a great opportunity.
Thank you very much. Next question here is from Abe Eustace. Do you have any concerns or are you aware of any issues around the shortage of uranium supply over the next few years?
Nope. No shortage. Don't worry about it. Next question.
Quick one then. Next question from Tim Kaminsky. What specifically, in your view, needs to change in the regulatory environment so that we can build new nuclear capacity?
Well, as a former regulator, I'll take that one on. I think the regulator is addressing issues associated with advanced reactors. They're processing the NuScale license as we speak, and that's going fairly well as far as I understand. So I think the regulator is managing the issue. I don't think that the future of nuclear is dependent on the regulator. It's dependent on the ability of new entrants, vendors, etc., to design plants that work, that function, and that can be built economically and can deal with the construction issues.
Great, we'll move on to the next question unless anybody else has any other thoughts on that.
I will just sort of throw into the debate here. So, the NuScale review did go on schedule on time, but it was 42 months. And, frankly, we need to get to a point, and it took us a long time to get there, and we spent a lot of money to get there. Now, any new large technology that has consequence to people that benefit them could also harm them. And I don't care if it's a jet plane or a drug, it's $1 billion. But the amount of time it takes, we need to really shrink that down. And I think really there was the opportunity, not to relax safety, but to take 2 or 3 years to develop an application and then 3 years worth of reviewed and approved. We need to shrink that down to maybe 4 years. If you could do that, then you become more competitive with other technologies. Because frankly, the rest of the world, they're looking at, do I have power to put the lights on, power my hospitals, provide drinking water? If you have to wait an extra 3 or 4 years for the clean option, they're going to choose the carbon option. They just are. So we need to be able to shrink that down. I think it's possible, but that's what I would cite.
And just to build on Chris's comment, there's been a transformation effort underway at NRC since actually, late in the Obama administration, and I think that will continue. That should continue. As we see more in the way of progress towards increasingly risk-informing the decision making there. I think there are the types of opportunities for improvement that Chris talks about and keep us heading in a positive direction.
Can I just say from the regulatory point of view, because we hear from the other side complaints that the it takes too long. But the regulator actually moves quickly often if the application is stellar. And then when the questions that the regulator will inevitably ask about the application are answered in a timely manner. And so often the regulator is dependent on the speed of the vendor, the manufacturer, to respond. So that is often the problem. That's the bottleneck, not the regulator.
Yeah, so, I think that NuScale submitted a letter on lessons learned out of our review. And again, the NRC committed to a 42-month review. They did it in 42 months. I'm not complaining about that at all. I'm saying is that going forward for reviews, they need to find a way to do them more efficient. And we try to put forward, helpfully, as NuScale, what we think could be ways of doing that. And it wasn't to say that people were just sitting there doing nothing. It's just you can do things more efficiently and better, get the same safety result, and frankly, I think probably a better safety result by not spending as much time on it.
Okay. Our next question is maybe a little off topic from our webinar today, but I want to ask it since we have had a few questions come in on the issue, on the topic rather. And I know it's been said that fusion has been 30 years away for the last few decades, pretty consistently, but do you have any thoughts on this technology and when and if it could be a reality?
It remains 30 years away. It's a constant of physics. I think it's a really hard thing to do, to get to the point, whether you're doing, depending on the kind of fusion you're doing, to get to the point where you're really getting significant energy out of the system. And that is the trick. And it's very, very difficult to do.
Yeah, the one thing that's been different about that in the last few years is, again, the emergence of these private sector firms that are trying to take this technology out of what's traditionally been a national lab and university arena and try to commercialize it. Allison, I think one of them's from your alma mater there, MIT. There are a few others that are making a go at it. They're well funded with venture capital. It's a challenge, absolutely. I'm not going to rule anything out, though, at this point, and which is great because we know we're going to need a lot of tools in the toolkit going forward, and if these guys can make it work, great.
Full disclosure, I spent a summer interning at the Plasma Fusion Center at MIT back during the day. And back then it was, I think, only 30 years away, so we missed that anniversary date for that. So I kind of tend to agree with Allison's assessment. And, John, all I can say is that you can take the technology out of the lab. You can't take the physics of the second law of thermodynamics out of the technology. That is just an irresolute, difficult thing to get over. And I'm happy to see people trying to work hard on it, but man, it still seems hard.
Yep.
Great. So for all of our panelists, do you have any optimism that Congress, and this is from Ken Silverstein, do you have any optimism that Congress will pass a carbon tax? And if not a carbon tax, are there other specific policies that could add value to nuclear power?
Well, just to the comments from earlier, it does seem like the clean energy standard is what's driving the conversation on the Hill now, vice a carbon tax or cap and trade. So, and clearly there's a lot of energy right now behind trying to get a clean energy standard through. It was certainly a central part of the president's American Jobs Act proposal. So I think that will be the direction of the conversation here over the next year or two.
The Senate is a heavy lift.
Thank you. Next question here, and we've had a few people offer their thoughts going back to the conversation about 12 and 6-pack of reactors. This one is for Chris. People have suggested a couple of one-off options. For example, Amy Curtright suggested military bases. Can you provide your view on the feasibility of these one-off uses and how widespread that could be?
It can be very widespread because the reactors can be end of the line or independent and isolable, so they don't require a grid to operate. The challenge of military bases is that typically they're well integrated into the existing electricity system. They like the cheap power more than anybody else because anything they're not paying for power, they can use for their mission. And they're never sitting there saying that, hey, I have extra money let me give some back to you. I've never seen it happening in a military base. So it really comes down to, for those folks, you have to be able to compete on the economics of it. And, you know, certain areas I think we could compete, but the military has been very clear. They don't want to own them. They don't want to operate them. They just want, you know, reliable, resilient power out of them. And that's what they're kind of looking for. And that presents the challenge, because most of those bases aren't, you know, contrary to what we think, they're not hundreds of megawatts, they're tens of megawatts. So they're really small.
Excellent. Next question is from Wesley Patrick. Jennifer Granholm stated today that Yucca Mountain is not the path forward. Though this site has local support and has passed all the Nuclear Waste Policy Act hurdles, but the responsible agency has canceled it. How can such actions counter to established law and policy be overcome?
Can you repeat the last bit of the question, Kevin?
Sure. How can such actions, which run counter to established law and policy, be overcome?
I think the larger problem here, and this is something that the Blue Ribbon Commission identified pretty early on, is that the problem with Yucca Mountain is that it was forced upon the state of Nevada. And the state of Nevada, since the 1987 Amendments Act, when Yucca Mountain was the only site identified, the state of Nevada has said, we don't want this. For over 35 years, they've said, we don't want this. If that's not evidence of a community and a larger community saying, no, this is not working for us, that's why the Blue Ribbon Commission emphasized so strongly that it's important and essential to have consent-based siting. And that's why it won't work. Just because something is law doesn't mean it actually works in a democracy when there are ways of resisting that. And so I think we need to really go back to the drawing board and try to take on some of the lessons that, you know, John and I put 2 years of our lives into learning, and go forward. And he did more than 2 years, because he tried to make some of this consent-based siting a reality.
Yeah, and Allison, I really think that underscores a point you made earlier about the necessity of really getting Congress and the administration to, you know, to come to the table and agree on a path forward. It's got to happen.
Yeah.
Okay, looks like we have time for one more question here. Let's go with the question from Mike Lubell. From a price standpoint, natural gas is a winner. Connecticut has asked ratepayers to pick up the cost differential between nuclear and natural gas, resulting in a public backlash against nuclear. Without a carbon tax or other carbon disincentive, how can nuclear compete? Will Gen 4 reactors be more cost effective, thereby providing an economic path forward?
So interesting you bring up the example of Connecticut, and for, you know, folks who don't know, you know, the state of Connecticut passed a law that it essentially allowed nuclear to compete in a separate energy market for other zero carbon resources. The state of Connecticut issued an integrated resource plan here just a few months ago, and they found that by preserving the Millstone plant, they avoided an estimated $1.8 billion in replacement costs if that would have been borne if Millstone had been shut down, and that preserving Millstone over the long term saves ratepayers $5 billion a year compared to other zero carbon pathways. That's from the state of Connecticut. So I can see where the narrative might be different than that, but the fact is, by retaining that zero carbon 24/7 generation, that's going to help you get to a decarbonized energy system that's more reliable and more affordable.
Yeah, I was going to say, you know, it's really a poor question in a sense, because it's not comparing it to a clean energy system. It's like saying, you know, hey, we don't want clean energy, we just want the cheapest. But absolutely, $2 gas is the way to go. Hallelujah, move forward. But if you want a clean energy system that is also affordable and resilient, it's not going to be gas, and it's not going to be gas with combined with carbon capture at the end of it either. I mean, you need a diversity of stuff.
In some ways, I hate to jump in here because this has been a fascinating conversation about such a crucial topic. It's clear that there's so many different aspects to how and whether and in what form nuclear power plays a role in our clean energy ecosystem going forward. I'd really encourage everyone to weigh in. We will have an online discussion on this topic following it and potentially publish a paper about this. I want to thank our panelists for a fantastic conversation, really diving into and providing very different perspectives on these difficult questions associated with nuclear power. I want to thank my co-host, Michael Shatskin, for his remarks at the beginning. Thank you to Jessica for moderating this. Thank all of our audience for taking the time to join us. Also, I'd like to recommend to everyone, if you don't use the OEP Energy Resource Library online, please check it out. It's the most comprehensive online library of papers, studies, reports, and so forth, well indexed on every energy topic that you all are working on, and an important program of our organization. We really encourage you to make use of it. So finally, to everyone, hope you're all staying healthy. I hope you have a good weekend, and thanks again, Chris, Allison, John, and Jessica, and to my co-host Mike, and to all of our partners. Thanks again, and we'll see you soon.
Thanks all.
Thanks,
Bye.
everyone.